Velkommen til episode 2 av MIF-podcasten. Først vil jeg si at i episode 1 så hadde vi en konkurranse om å navngi denne podcasten. Og det var mange gode forslag, men det var ett forslag som vi følte egentlig bare fanget alt vi snakker om her. Og det er jo Israel. Så Israelpodden, det ble navnet på denne podcasten, så takk for alle innslag, og gratulerer til vinneren. Og i dag, i episode 2 av Israelpodden, så har jeg med en spennende gjest. Mange av dere kjenner han kanskje fra før, og nå skal jeg gå over til engelsk, så jeg håper jeg går bra for dere. So, hello Shaun, welcome, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here on Israelpod.
Yes, you got it. It's Israelpodden.
Okay. Israelpod.
Yeah. So you are maybe familiar to many of our followers in MIF because you have been to the MIF conference a couple of times already.
Yes, I've had the honor of being at the MIF conference a couple of times and meeting a lot of your incredible sponsors and the really dedicated staff that are involved in MIF predominantly in Norway, but also in the other parts of Scandinavia as well.
Mm. So can you give us a little bit, tell us a little bit about you, your background, where you come from, where you grew up, and yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. And I wanna start a tradition here that so that we get to know you a little better. You have to tell one secret you never told anyone.
Okay, so let's see. I'll start off with my background, and I'm sure I'll get to a fun secret. I am born in Johannesburg, South Africa. I grew up in the Jewish community there. The Jewish community, when I was in South Africa, had about 85 to 90,000 Jews. And I grew up in a very interesting time as South Africa was emerging from the apartheid era. So that by the time I'd finished high school, already Nelson Mandela was our president. I was very involved in sports and other community activities. And I was also in a family that was not only just, I would call it an average Jewish family. The importance and role of Israel as an important part of our Jewish identity was always very clear to us. From a very young age, we would go and visit Israel very often. When I was 16, I took my first organized tour to Israel with my youth group. And it was a very personal thing for me that it became very clear that my future would be in Israel, and that's where I wanted to raise my family. It seemed a very natural progression for me and for my future. As much as South Africa was going through changes, I just felt a very personal drive that put me in my future in Israel. And then I finished high school and went to Israel initially for a year to study in yeshiva and seminary. After that, I drafted into the army. I did full army service in Israel. And then after the army, I went to university. I studied at Bar Ilan University. And in my final year at university, that is where I met my future wife. And I was doing my best to impress this young lady who I came from South Africa. She came from the US. She really wasn't paying enough attention to me. So here we're going to get to the secret. We were at an event for the English speakers at university. And in my attempt to try and really impress her, I cracked a raw egg into a glass and ate it there and then in front of her.
Real Rambo style.
Right. I don't know if she was impressed or disgusted, but I got enough of attention. Eventually, she agreed to start dating me, and we celebrated 21 years of marriage just a few months ago.
Oh, yeah. Congratulations.
Right. So, other than my wife, I don't think anybody knows that I once tried to, well, did eat a raw egg. So there's the secret.
Yeah, thank you.
If people want to do it, I don't necessarily recommend it, but for me, it worked. I got the girl of my dreams.
That sounds very good.
Right. So
So,
that's my history. Married, yeah, just over 20 years, four incredible children. My oldest is 19. She's in national service. I have a 17-year-old son who's in 12th grade, a 14-year-old daughter, and a 9-year-old son. Those are my children. And I'm sure you have more questions, so we'll move on from there.
so where do you and your family live right now?
So we live in Jerusalem. We've been here for most of the time. We live in an area called Katamonim, very beautiful. There's a very mixed community around us of, I would say, various different olim, people who've moved to Israel from various countries, Australia, South America, Americans. Obviously, the community is predominantly Israeli speak Israel. Um, my kids speak a variety of English and Hebrew, depending on who they're speaking to. And we very much enjoy where we are. In that also, I'm relatively lucky in that I'm close to work, and we can speak about that in a minute.
So you live in what you would say a safe community, and it's you don't feel it's not dangerous to walk outside after 9.
Not at all. In fact, it is uh, it is 9:15 here in Jerusalem, and my two teenage children are not even home yet. My 19-year-old, she's on her way back for the weekend. She is from her national service, so she's probably either on a bus or getting off a bus around about now from the central station. My 17-year-old son is actually on his way home from up north, and I'm not expecting him. He's up north with some friends at a. Um, he travels around different parts of the country where they do tours and explanations about certain biblical issues. I'm not expecting him home until 11 o'clock tonight. Yeah, he'll get on a public bus and walk home. It's incredible. My 9-year-old is now old enough to walk by himself to school, and we're at the point where I still want to walk him to school, and he's running ahead of me.
Oh yeah, well that sounds very similar to where I grew up in a very like small village outside of Bergen, Norway's second largest city, and yeah, sounds
Well,
very safe. Sounds like you can send your children and no worries.
absolutely, and it's not that we're outside of the city; we actually live in the city, which is, I
Yeah.
think, even more incredible.
Mm. So so thank you for giving us a little background information about you. So now we know you a little better. And you also have a very interesting job. And I think for many of our viewers, it will be very interesting to hear that what you do for a living. So you work in a company called NGO Monitor, and this is a non-governmental organization monitor. So your job is to investigate non-governmental organizations to see if they are doing what they claim to do, or if they are doing working political against Israel primarily. Is that correct?
That is one way to describe it. So yeah, for the last more than almost 12 years, I've had the privilege of working at an organization called NGO Monitor. The organization itself was founded 22 years ago by Professor Steinberg. It was initially started as an academic project. If we go back 20 something years ago, there was a conference in Durban, South Africa, where this United Nations conference was supposed to deal with issues of racism and xenophobia around the world, but unfortunately, the conference just became an anti-Israel, if you want to call it, hate fest. And our founder, Professor Steinberg, was a professor at university, and he began looking into what he called the powers of the NGO lobby. Because I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with very large and well-known organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And for the Norwegians, there's Norwegian People's Aid and the Norwegian Refugee Council. I'm not even going to try and pronounce them in Norwegian. I'll just butcher the names. And these organizations, which are supposed to be responsible for human rights, defending human rights and defending aid, when it comes to Israel, many of these organizations are advocacy groups, and even more troubling is they're anti-Israel advocacy groups. They seem to have forgotten about the fact that they're supposed to care about human rights for everyone, and they've just become groups that have completely become anti-Israel. Some would call them pro-Palestinian, but very rarely is it anything other than just an anti-Israel agenda. So over the last couple of years, I moved to studying the political agendas of how these organizations very quickly moved from being human rights groups to having significant political agendas. And then the other part of our job is not only just investigating their activities, but is also the funding. And that became a major part of what we do, because it became fascinating to see that civil society groups, especially in Israel and the Palestinian Authority and other areas, these organizations are supposed to represent the best of our society. And we have a situation in our region of the world. Civil society groups are not funded by civil society. So we have instances where organizations that claim to represent Israeli civil society are primarily funded by overseas governments, Norway being one of the largest governments, but it's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the European Union, and other countries are the primary funders of advocacy groups that in some cases are advocating against the state of Israel. And that has become a very troubling trend, because we see that it's not only Palestinian groups, sometimes it's Israeli groups as well. So, for example, we have Israeli organizations that are based here in Israel with names like Breaking the Silence and B'Tselem. And these organizations, because they're based in Israel, they're often going to be quoted in Norwegian media. And they're saying, well, these are Israeli organizations, and they're very critical of Israel. In some cases, they're openly hostile to the idea of a Jewish state, but they're quoted in Norwegian media because they're Israeli. The reality is these are actually very fringe, small organizations, but because the majority of their funding comes from foreign governments, they're able to get their message out a lot further. And they're everything, when we often think of a non-government organization, but in this case, most of their funding comes from government. They're not even representing Israeli civil society, because their message isn't for Israel, it's for overseas audiences, very often, for example, Norwegian media. So that is another aspect of the work we do, where we try and expose the fact that non-governmental organizations are very much sometimes ideological. They don't represent the human rights agenda that they claim. They have their own political agenda, and unfortunately, sometimes it's a very anti-Israel political agenda, even if these organizations are based in Israel. So that's one aspect. There's more to it as well when we look at organizations that are based in the Palestinian Authority, whether it's Ramallah or even Gaza. And here again, we see a huge amount of Norwegian funding, millions, in fact, tens of millions of Norwegian krona that go to anti-Israel advocacy organizations. And it's important to point out, I'm not even speaking about UNRWA or other United Nations organizations here. This is just for political advocacy organizations. Organizations that have names like Al-Haq or the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, or even nice sounding names like Defense for Children International Palestine. But in reality, these organizations have very clear anti-Israel agendas. If your subscribers are familiar with the International Court of Justice, for example, where South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice and is accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza, the organizations that are there supporting South Africa and, in fact, being part of the evidence against South Africa are all funded by the Norwegian government. So we have a situation where the Norwegian government, and therefore Norwegian taxpayers, are funding the court case against Israel at the International Court of Justice.
So, how much do you think the Norwegian government know about their anti-Israel ideologies in these organizations? Do you think the Norwegian government know about this, or is this just a small part of the organization, so it's kind of difficult to find these political ideologies they have, because they proclaim that they are something else. Of course, this is what they sell to the government to get money, to get funding.
So unfortunately, I don't think it's a case of they don't know anymore. We're talking just in the human rights aspect of this, not major UN organizations and UNRWA. We're speaking about 200 million crowns a year, or 200 million krona a year. Now, in the scale of the big international budget, that's not a lot of money, but it's more money than you can claim we don't know about. And when you say these 200 million are going to organizations to support the anti-Israel causes at the United Nations, or 200 million that goes to organizations that want Israel tried at the International Criminal Court, or want Israel charged at the National Court of Justice, or more recently, many of these organizations are involved in other court cases. For example, Norway is part of the F-35 program, but in Denmark, in Netherlands, and the UK, there are Norwegian-funded NGOs that are trying to have Israel's participation in the F-35 program rescinded, and they want to have an arms embargo against Israel. And this is being done very often with Norwegian funding. And I don't think the Norwegian Foreign Ministry can still say they don't know that this is happening.
Mm. So you for them, if they are okay with this happening, then they are in a good position, because they can pretend they don't know. But so it's kind of from their point of view, they don't have anything to lose in a reputation or anything, because they are giving to something they can say is good. And if something bad is happening, everyone else have to prove this, and then you can say the proof is not, I don't recognize this proof. So you understand what I mean?
I do. So I'll give you another example, and this is what we see a lot. Norway is a very wealthy country. It's a beautiful country. You have incredible people in your country. And as a result of years of prosperity, Norway is regarded, well, it's not you can't exactly call it a world superpower, but it regards itself somewhat as an aid superpower. Norwegians are very proud of the fact that you give a lot of international aid. Okay, now I don't want to get, it's your own discussion. I don't want to get into, I don't want to be critical of how Norwegians spread their aid around the world. That's for you guys to decide. But I'm going to speak very generally. When it comes to international aid, there's a couple of areas where everyone will agree that aid is important. So if you are giving international aid to education, right, you can't really be critical of that. Let's say you're giving aid to an educational institute in sub-Saharan Africa. Now that's great. You give a 500 million crowns to various educational institutes in the developing parts of Africa. Now, after 4 or 5 years, you can come back and say, okay, did you build schools? Did you print textbooks? Did you train teachers? Is the literacy rate in that area higher? That is how you can evaluate if your money was put to good use. And if none of those things happen, you know your money wasn't put to good use. There's a tangible way of judging. The same thing can be said for healthcare. you give money to healthcare in the developing part of South America. I'm using that as an example for you. Okay, so you train doctors, you train nurses, you prepare vaccines, you build hospitals, you build clinics, you give um, uh, seminars on early childhood education. All these type of things are really, really important, and that is where aid can be most effective. And if the healthcare in a region that is getting a whole lot of Norwegian funding doesn't improve over years, you can tell that your money wasn't well spent. And these are just two examples of where aid can be judged, and you can tell how it's going to work. But when it comes to human rights, how do you judge if the money is going to the right place? How do you judge success in the field of human rights? And if you can't judge success, how do you judge failure? And that's the problem with giving money to human rights and advocacy is there's no real way of judging success or failure. So you're constantly just going to give money to the same things, to the same organizations. And there's no real way of knowing if your money is going to the right place. And what's worse is then you just keep giving more and more money, not knowing if you've achieved anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I know this what you said, the first thing about how we measure aid money. This we've talked about this in Norway. Like, do we have a control over the money we give, that they give the effect that we hope, and what they say they want to spend the money on, and they have admitted it's very, very little control of this. We don't see the effect. We don't know. And even though these proof came, there are still no change in how we are thinking about aid. So for Norwegians, when we have measurements to see if the money have effect, but we don't get any answers. We don't see any effect from it. We still want to give money because we want to be nice. So I think for how to see if like, it's very difficult to measure the are humans feeling more happy now? Are they better?
Right.
Are they, yes? How do we measure this? So
that's exactly the problem. And I'll add another challenge to all of that is using specific Norwegian examples. Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the largest aid organizations in the world, gets billions from the Norwegian government um, to work in our region. So whether they're working in Gaza or whether they're working in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, they are getting all this money from the Norwegian government to work here. Now, the Norwegian Refugee Council then hires local NGOs to carry out their projects here. They, in fact, the NRC doesn't actually work here in a major way. They hire local organizations. Now, when we've asked the NRC for the names of those organizations, they won't tell us. In fact, they won't tell much. They won't give that information to anyone. In some cases, only the governments know, because the NRC isn't only funded by the Norwegian government. They also get a lot of money from Sweden and from the British government. And these governments refuse to tell us or anybody who the NRC is working with here. And that is a huge problem, because not only can we be speaking about anti-Israel advocacy groups, in some cases, in fact, in a number of cases, we found some of these organizations are even affiliated to terrorist organizations like the old Marxist organization, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in some cases, these NGOs, again, with funding, we found a very troubling case in fact when a Dutch-funded NGO, two of their members carried out a terrorist bombing and murdered somebody. Now, we've actually asked the NRC if they work with this NGO, and they refuse to tell us. They refuse to tell us. They refuse to tell anyone. Now, I definitely don't want to accuse NRC of being involved in terror, but it's very troubling that an organization that is heavily funded by the Norwegian government is not telling anybody who they're working with in Israel or in Gaza or in the West Bank, where we do have many issues of funding going to bad organizations, and in some cases being used by organizations that can somehow be connected to terrorist organizations. So that creates a very huge problem.
Okay, we're back. I had little camera issues here. But Shaun, tell me, how is your method when you are investigating an organization to find out what they're doing?
So we have a number of researchers. The first thing we actually do is we look at the financial records of the organization itself, whether they're based in Europe or whether they're based in Europe or in Israel, or different parts, even if whether they're based in Europe, whether they're based in Israel, or even in different parts of North America, sometimes South America. The first thing we look at is the financial transparency of the organization. Do they produce regular reports about who is funding them? And then, more importantly, we look at any of the organizations that have charitable status, because then they, by law, have to give all of their major donors. And the next thing we look at is government donors. So if a particular organization has a large list of government donors, they're getting money from Norway, they're getting money from Sweden, even from the United States. And then we track that money. And the next stage is look at the governments and make sure that the amounts match up. So if an organization claims they're getting $1 million from the United States government, we then have to go to the various arms of the US government and have to actually comb through information and see that the amount of money matches up, whether it's over years or months. Actually, one of the most transparent countries with regards to who they gave money to is Norway. The Norwegian Foreign Ministry has an excellent website where they regularly update how much money they're giving to civil society and aid organizations around the world. And even if it's not updated regularly, they have a very good organization where you can go back. It's called microdata, and you can go back and download Excel sheets of lots of information going back many, many years. So credit to the Norwegian government. I know I've been very critical over the beginning of this podcast of the Norwegian government, but from a transparency point of view, the government is actually excellent and very transparent of where certain monies go. The problem comes when it goes to further down, like the Norwegian Refugee Council and further from there. So we look at the organization's funding, and then the next thing is we look at what does the organization do? What reports do they put out? Are the reports properly sourced? And then we look at who writes the reports. Very often we'll find more often the people who write anti-Israel reports, they themselves are not necessarily neutral. They have very much anti-Israel agendas. In some cases, when we look at their social media, we can see very troubling responses. Not too long ago, we saw a variety of organizations where the people who work there were not only putting out anti-Israel material, they were putting out blatant anti-Semitism. Just this week in Denmark, Action Aid Denmark, Benswood Samwerk was forced to let go 2 of their board members who were putting on social media very anti-Semitic information. So that's also something, again, we didn't find this, but this is information. In fact, this came from MIF in Denmark. Shout out to Rika and the work she did there. But this is an example of the type of information that I think anybody can do. And for anyone who's listening, look at these social media accounts, look at where the information is coming from. It doesn't only have to be NGO Monitor that does this work. Everyone does it, and it's very important. So those are the different aspects we work in. And then we have a very large team that does this type of information seeking in Arabic as well.
So, just a little technical question. Like
Sure.
you say, Norway is very transparent with where they send the money, what organization, the amount. But
Yeah.
is it also like a metadata? So you would know exactly what bank accounts this is going to. So, or do you
No.
have to go some backdoor way to find this information? Like,
No. So,
no.
okay. So, very important to point out, we only work in what's called open source information. Only what is actually put out by the government or the organization themselves. We do not use secretive hacking techniques or, secret service. We don't do that at all. We only look at what is publicly available. And because we will only publish information that is publicly available. So if the government says they give this amount of money, we will put that out there. If the organization says we receive this money, we will put that out there. If the organization publishes something, we will in some cases, we will look through the data and say, look, you got this information really wrong, and we'll be very critical. And if somebody puts something in social media that is blatantly anti-Semitic, the social media is a public platform. We will expose that, and then we will often go to the governments and say, "You're giving money to these people. You need to do something about it." So it's all above board. It is all open source. We don't do anything behind closed doors.
Is NGO Monitor an NGO itself?
Absolutely, we are.
Yeah.
We are a non-governmental organization. All of our funding is available on our website. You can look at who our Israeli donors are. We have a separate donor page for funds that come from Europe or from North America. And per Israeli law, every financial quarter we publish our information. We, as an organization, refuse to accept any government funding. While we will very happily work with whichever government of the day in Israel or anyone else, we will provide our information, we'll meet with people. But as a non-governmental organization, we need to remain non-governmental, so we will not receive funding from governments. All our information is either private from philanthropists or from donor organizations.
Have you heard of an organization in Norway? It's called SAI. SAI. Like
No,
Sierra Alpha India Hotel.
no, I have not. I'm looking at them now. SAI Norway, Students Association.
Yes.
Okay,
This is an organization that MIF, we recently posted an article and a video about this, because this is something you should look into, actually.
I will. I haven't heard of them before. Okay.
They are a student organization that they want to make like academia human right. So it's like so many nice words and nice intention in how they present themselves, but they have like a dark side. They are also openly, from 2024, they are now as an organization boycotting Israel. So this is a tip to you. You should look into them. And they I think receive 11 million a year.
Okay.
So they are yeah.
All right. Well, you've given me something to do. I'm definitely going to look into them. So here we go. You asked me about my day. The first thing I'm going to do on Sunday is look into this organization, look at their funding. I'll already tell you now, I'm looking at some of their reports that they've put out about what is going on. And here's where NGO Monitor comes in. Their reports about decolonization and what is going on in Israel and Gaza all quote the organizations that we monitor. And here again, these organizations themselves, some of them have these aren't human rights organizations. When an organization says their goal is the end of the Jewish state, or when an organization says October 7th was a resistance act, and these are the organizations that SAI is quoting, it says a lot about what their agenda is.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm starting to see like the biggest organizations who provide most anti-Israel material, the smaller organizations are kind of stealing or taking the information from them again. So this creates like a pyramid of the same, yeah.
Exactly. I'll give you another example how this works. Let's say a particular government. So let's say the government in Iceland, right? They want to give money for human rights. Now, they will fund a human rights organization, a political human rights organization that is anti-Israel, right? This organization will then publish a report, the report that makes it to media in Iceland. Iceland then says, oh, wow, we need to do something about human rights. We'll give money to this organization. This organization then goes to the United Nations and says Israel is bad. So the United Nations will then quote the same organization, and the same organization, because they're quoted by the United Nations, then gets back into, say, larger media in the New York Times. And then from that, they will now get funded by Denmark. And the Danish government will say, wow, this organization says it's really bad. Now they're going to be funded by Norway. And it's the same tiny anti-Israel organization that is now being played up and funded and quoted and requoted in all these different things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same organization.
Yeah.
It's not like it's any new information. It's the exact same thing.
There you have a prime example of lobby
Exactly.
activity. Yeah.
It's circular funding. And what is even worse is the government is funding the organization to lobby the government.
Mm. Well, it's a important work you do, and I think that many Norwegian taxpayers are not happy about that these organizations are proclaiming they are something for good, because they use all these words like solidarity, and everyone is included, and a place in the world for everyone except the Jews, with the small letters. And many, like all of MIF members and everyone who are friends of Israel in Norway, they would not appreciate knowing about this.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, why an organization like MIF is so important, is because it's not just the MIF members, it's the fact that the MIF members use their own networks, whether it's their friends or posting on social media or writing letters. And more importantly, because we're blessed to live in a democracy, you can hold your politicians accountable and start telling them, look, this is not good, that our money is, not only is it not being used for human rights, it's being used for anti-Israel propaganda, and it needs to change.
I think with this government present, I think it will be difficult to challenge them on organizations that are boycotting Israel right now, because they are very actively doing it themselves. I'm
less, I know it's a problem, I'm less negative. And I'll tell you why, for two reasons. The first is, even in the current budget, there is a line about not supporting BDS, not supporting boycotts. So it's just about the government making sure that they follow their own guidelines. That's the first thing. Even the current government, I think that's there. The second is governments change. Even the current government, and it doesn't look great in Norway, as people have often told me, governments change. Over time, governments change. And the most important thing for everyone in MIF is to, the English saying is, keep your chin up, keep fighting the good fight, because things will change, and things will change for the better. Across the street from Norway in Sweden, people used to tell me, look, Sweden is a socialist left-wing country, and it'll be that way forever. Well, truth is, for the last couple of years, the government in the government in Sweden has changed significantly, and we're seeing important changes there. Now, put aside, yes, I know there's issues of the Swedish Democrats and everyone is worried about it, but that also means the public in certain in Sweden, for example, have become more pro-Israel. There is a significant amount. And in Norway, you have a large amount of people, as far as I can tell, who are not at their heart anti-Israel. They want what's best for the world. And I think it's important that everyone in MIF keeps fighting. Things will change, and things will change for the better.
Yeah, that is a good word of wisdom to all of us in MIF. We are patient and we are waiting, and we think change will come too. And this is also what we work for. We want to do what we can to change people's hearts, and give them good and correct information, give them the truth.
Right. There's very quickly, I'll tell you, there's a saying in Hebrew. The saying is like this: Am la netzach lo mefached derech haokal. And what does this mean in English? Is it's a saying about Judaism, is the eternal people are never afraid of the long road. And I think that's a message for everyone who it's not only about being Jewish. It's, I think, anybody who in MIF and everywhere else who truly believes that we're fighting the good fight, never be afraid of the longer road.
Yeah, that's true. You just need to have a little longer perspective than this week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This week might not be great. Next week will be better. This week's the next week, next month, decades.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we'll probably get. You asked me about something positive when we were discussing before this podcast. I always say, if I could go back to a period of time 75, 80 years ago, and I told people, I'm living in Jerusalem with 4 beautiful children, and I go and pray at the old city at the Western Wall, and the old temple the Temple Mount is in front of me, and the Jewish state that I live in is a high-tech giant. And people, if I would tell this to people 100 years ago, they would tell me, "Go back to bed, you're drunk."
Go back to
bed, you're drunk.
Bed, you're drunk.
You're mad.
Yeah.
Imagine telling people 100 years ago that there's this Jewish state and it's a high-tech powerhouse, and my children are running around in Jerusalem. It's beautiful. It makes no sense. And if I were to go back 1,000 years ago, people would tell me that I'm describing messianic times. But the truth is, all of this is real, and it's just about realizing the beauty of what we have at the moment and how it has taken years to get here.
So I want to shift the focus a little bit, because you, among many people in Israel, have been part of the military. And if I remember correctly, this military service is almost 3 years, obligatory for everyone. It's 2 years, 8 months. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. So everyone in Israel is obliged to serve. I did as well. I served in a combat role, and when you are released from your regular service, many people will also serve in the reserves. So for the last 20 plus years, I have been a reserve soldier. And that means at least once a year I do reserve duty, whether it's training for a few days or a few weeks, or even deployment for sometimes a month at a time. It means that I have my uniform and some of my equipment at home. It means that if a war breaks out, as happened, I need to leave my family and go defend my people and my country.
So this 2 years, 8 months, this is in a one continuity. Like first you do this, and then you are a reservist for forever, or 10, 20, or. So
the law has changed. It used to be until you were 40, and I continue. I'm a senior sergeant, so I've continued volunteering. And I think now the law might change till you're 45. So this you do A lot of people will take off a year right up between high school and the army, whether it's to study in yeshiva like I did. Some people do national service and volunteering. And then there's at least a 2.5 to 3 year period of military service. You finish the military, people start life, university. But until we're 40 or 45, yeah, we're all in reserve duty.
So, how long time do you train before they send you? Like now, Israel are in a war, and some people they was recruited 6 months ago or like 1 year ago for the first time. Are these people now fighting?
No. Okay. So um, it very much depends on what your role is in the army. There's this perception. I know Norway also has mandatory draft, but not a lot of people wind up doing different roles. So there's this perception that everyone is a combat soldier and we're there with a gun on the front lines. The reality is that the Israeli army, um, less than a quarter, probably closer to 20%, maybe even less, are actually combat. Because if you imagine that every combat soldier needs food, needs ammunition, needs all an entire system around it. So the actual combat part of the army is very, very small. Now, a combat soldier actually goes through a very long period of training. Basic training is usually about 4 months, and I'm talking from a combat perspective. Basic training is 4 months, and that is um, learning how to shoot, how to use a rifle, a lot of discipline, and it basically turns you into a very basic soldier. From there, there's usually between 2 and 3 months of advanced training, and that is usually for more advanced combat soldiers, how to work in a team, how to use special weapons, um, how to conquer territory or how to defend territory, how to work with the Air Force or artillery, all these different aspects of it. And you then specialize in wherever you're going to go. And then there's usually 2 or 3 months more training after that when you are at the battalion and brigade level. And then there's active deployment, which can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And then most soldiers will either go to sergeant's course or officer's course, and then you're on a rotation usually of 3 months training or courses and then 3 months deployment. Unfortunately, now we're all in a war situation, so it's pretty much been straight combat, and then there's rest time, and then training, and you go back into combat. But that's the general army. For a reservist like me, it's a very different situation.
If we jump a little, 7th of October, then I can assume that when they start realizing what was happening, the calls went out, all the reservists, including yourself, was being called.
Right. So I will tell you my personal story of October 7th it was a Saturday morning, Shabbat morning, but it was also the end of the festive period of Sukkot. So it's a very long festive period. And my wife and I decided to go to the synagogue very, very early in the morning with the idea that we would go to synagogue early in the morning, we would come back, we would have a cup of coffee together, and then our children, who are much older, would go to different synagogues, and eventually we would join them. We would have lunch together. That was the plan. Um, at 8:15 in the morning, we were just finishing prayers when there were the first sirens over Jerusalem. And my immediate concern, I looked and saw my wife, and we had this understanding, was my immediate concern was what's happening with our children. Are they at home? Where are they? So against everything that people are supposed to do, I actually ran outside during the siren. We were supposed to run into a bomb shelter. I ran outside because I wanted to get home as soon as possible to check on my children. And when I'm outside and I heard the siren, I also heard the Iron Dome interception. Now, this is over Jerusalem. That is not supposed to be a regular occurrence. Not only did I hear the interception, I felt the shock waves. So you actually feel something. If you want to, like something, an intense explosion, you feel it. You don't just hear it. And for me, that was the immediate something is different. This isn't just it's definitely not a false alarm. It's not a one-off thing. If there's a Iron Dome interception over Jerusalem, something is very, very wrong. So I ran into our apartment. My teenage children had already gone to a different synagogue. My youngest son had put himself in the bomb shelter. So I sat with him. I calmed him down. He was very upset. I waited for my wife to come home, and I immediately had this instinct that something is wrong. I told her I'm going to go get our teenage children, and I did something that I never do on Shabbat. I turned on my cell phone. Shabbat is the one time where my cell phone is never on. I turned it on and I put it in my pocket, and I ran to where my teenage children were, and I brought them home. And the entire time I felt my phone was vibrating, was buzzing in my pocket. So what I did was I looked at my phone. Just 1 second. Anyway, you were asking me about children, so here's an example. This is my son is just getting on a bus now, and it's 10:15 at night. He was just letting me know that it's going to be later than he thought.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's why. I'm just going to send a quick message to my wife to let her know, and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, so you never see the action of the Iron Dome over Israel. Like this is
No, over Jerusalem it's very, very. The last time there was anything like this was about 5 years ago, and that was a one-off, and it was very unusual. So I knew something was wrong, and like I said, to feel the vibration of the explosion it meant something was very off. So I brought my children. So let's pick it up. So I ran to get my children, and the whole time I feel my phone is vibrating in my pocket. I get them all home. There was another siren after that. All of us came out of the shelter, and instead of making a cup of coffee for myself and my wife, I took a shot of whiskey. I thought it was important just to calm myself down. And then I looked at my phone, and I saw the first thing was all the news feeds. Being at an organization that deals with current affairs, I get news feeds all the time. And then the second thing I noticed was a WhatsApp from my battalion, my battalion commander, who said, "Look, something bad has happened down south. There are rockets all over the country. We are now our unit is now on alert." So I told my wife, "Look, we've got this feeling something is wrong. It's now about 9:15 in the morning. I'm going to go down to the storeroom and get my army equipment." So I went down into our storeroom. I have my uniforms and my equipment packed away. I brought up my bag, and by the time I'd got up, I'd already received another WhatsApp from my commander saying, "Look, there's a very good chance we're going to be deployed. Can you start making your way to your call-out base?" So I went into our bedroom. I took off my clothing. I put on my uniform, opened up my army bag, threw in a couple of pairs of underwear, socks, t-shirts, a few things that I need. And then I spoke to my family. I said, "Look, I think there's a war going on. Things are still very unclear. Whatever is happening is very serious." I gave everyone a kiss. I sent a message to my captain, who lives not very far from me. I said, "Look, I'm ready to go." He said, "Great, I'll be at your house in 10 minutes." And he picked me up and two other guys along the way. And we have an emergency deployment center not too far from Jerusalem, which is a very, very large army base that is just huge storerooms where in the case of a war, we drive there, and every unit has their own store, and when we get there, we get our equipment and our rifles. And this takes a few hours. When we were there, and people are coming in from all over the country from my particular unit, and more and more people are telling us, "Look, whatever is happening down south is terrible. Nobody knows for sure, but we need to get our equipment and get prepared as soon as possible. And from there, once most of my battalion was already there with our equipment, we have a very specific role in my unit, and that is to get to a certain part of the West Bank so that whichever regular forces unit, special forces unit is there, they can go to wherever they need to go. That is our job, and we've trained for that for many, many years, and that is what we did. We knew our job was not necessarily to get involved in the fighting in Gaza, but to go to where a particular unit is so that they can go and fight in Gaza. And that's exactly what we did. And we were deployed within a very few hours. We were deployed, and we saw these young kids. They're in their early 20s, and we got to their base as soon as possible, and they're all ready and everything. And we said to them, look, guys, you're going into war. Good luck. We're here to swap you. And they went off, and it was a very emotional time, especially because some of these guys were the first into Gaza. More importantly, some of these were the first soldiers to show up at the kibbutzim communities down south, where they fought like lions against overwhelming odds. And some of them, the young boys that we saw, were lost in battle in the first few hours of October 7th and October 8th. And more importantly, when Israel finally went into Gaza later in October, these were the first units that went in, and some of these incredible kids, unfortunately, were lost in battle. A neighbor of mine who lives across the road from us, he was in a different unit, but he was in an ambush where they tried to rescue hostages. Unfortunately, he lost both of his legs. So it was a very emotional time. I wound up, because of the nature of the work we do, I was deployed in reserve duty from the morning of October 7th right up until the beginning of May, which was a very, very long time to be away. I was lucky in that after a few months, I was able to come home every few weeks and see my family and my children. But it was a very difficult time.
Yeah, I absolutely can imagine all the worries. I can imagine when you don't have the full picture, you don't know the full impact of it all. And you are in the West Bank. You are. I can only imagine just listening in. You are seeking information all the time, and but how was it to be for you in the West Bank? Did you see a reaction there from the people from the attack, or like was it just a normal day to be there?
No, it was definitely not a normal day to be there. And one of the first things we did was to ensure that anyone who wants to celebrate the tragedy of October 7th, we immediately made sure that our presence was felt and that they shouldn't be celebrating. And the most important job we had over the entire period from October until, like I said, until May, was to ensure that the terrorist groups that were operating in the West Bank were not able to operate. That meant we were very active in pursuing terrorists and terrorist activity, illegal weaponry. That was our job, was to make sure that the West Bank would remain as calm as possible so that the soldiers in Gaza could do their job.
Hmm. So
and that was our role.
Yeah. So there was no. We didn't see implications of aggression starting from the people there as like a reaction.
So there was initially, especially the first day, there were fireworks and celebration, but we made sure to stop this very quickly.
So how long were you stationed there at the West Bank?
So officially I was there from the 7th of October until the beginning of May. So all in all, we counted 160 days of reserve duty.
Oh wow!
So,
in one go.
In one go. So again, I did get to go home a couple of times in between. I'd say After the first month, I was in pretty much the whole time. I got a few hours to see my family in between. But the next few months, every 2 weeks or so, I got to go home for 2 days. So it was usually 14 days in the army, 2 days at home, 14 days in the army, 2 days at home.
It seems like an intense time.
Yeah, it was very difficult, especially, my leaving my wife and my 4 children. And it was very difficult, very emotional. Also because you're in the army, it's not like you're on a business trip. It was intense, but we had a very important job to do, and we did it.
So what would you say for yourself, for your troop colleagues and the Israelis fighting this war? How do you think they feel about the Palestinians now? Have these all gone from like neutral to hateful, or how do the soldiers feel about the Palestinians?
There's variety. There's no nice way to say that. Yes, very many people are angry. Many people I know are angry. But I think the bigger thing is it's more important to focus on ourselves than on the Palestinians who don't want us or hate us. How are we, as the nation of Israel, as Israelis, how are we going to, what is our role in all of this? And it's not about pointing fingers and saying who's wrong. It's how do we emerge from this better and stronger? And in a strange way, I think that's one of the reasons why I think the army is such an important part of Israeli society, in that every unit has everyone in it. And I mean by that, we have religious soldiers, we have irreligious soldiers, we have people from the political left, people from the political right, people who grew up in socialist kibbutzim, and people who grew up in the most wealthy parts of Tel Aviv, people who come from down south and people who come from up north. And we all serve in the same unit, and we're all there for the same purpose, and that is to protect our people and look after our country. And building the human connections between us, that is more important than focusing on the Palestinians and our opinion of them.
I think if you represent many people who think the same, I think that's amazing. It's for many people, I think this would have grow into like a permanent state of hate, and that's understandable if you have been very close and you have had your friends being massacred in the most brutal ways.
Yes, there's no doubt about it. I know of people who were in their own, were very much in this idea that we're supposed to have peace and harmony, and if we just love each other. And now there are some of these same people who are saying, they've lost faith in a peace process or anything else. I don't want to comment on how people have changed. I can only speak about myself, and I never had any illusions about a peace process with the Palestinians or with the greater Middle East. I think we need to be very real in that right now there's a lot of emotion, and not necessarily positive emotion. But the more important way to overcome all of it is, let's make peace with ourselves. Let's internally refocus on what is good within ourselves. And the next most important thing is, not the next, the other aspect of that is, we need to win this war. We need to make sure that Hamas are defeated. We need to make sure that the hostages are brought home. And we need to make sure that our country can recover from the terrible events that happened on October 7th.
So I can imagine that every Israeli have been reflecting around what's going to happen after this, or like how will the end of the war look like? and what would happen to the area of Gaza. What do you think will happen, or what do you hope will happen?
The most important thing is two things need to happen at the same time. One, the hostages come home. All of them have to come home. And the second, no less important, is that anybody in Gaza, whether they call themselves Hamas or the Islamic Jihad or anything else, anybody who wants to cause harm to Israel no longer has the ability or the desire to cause harm. That everybody who wants to fight against Israel is defeated and demoralized and will not be able to harm Israelis ever again.
So I think we have come to the end of this episode two of Israelpodden, and but Shaun, do you have any like final words towards the member of MIF, the Friends of Israel, and also the people of Norway who right now are a little anti-Israel? You have any final words for us?
So I think most importantly, as when we started, you said I've been to Norway a couple of times and I met the incredible people at MIF. I said this earlier, and I want to say it again, never give up. And I think that's also a message for that I think that is also a message that I've seen and experienced is we're fighting the good fight. We're fighting for Israel, for the Jewish people, for truth, for honesty, and for a better future for our children. We cannot give up. We will always need to do this, and everybody has their role to play. Whether it means some people will be in uniform, whether it means some people will go to a MIF conference, whether it means some people will just be able to give money to a good cause, whether it means being on a podcast, writing a letter to your member of parliament, everybody has a role to play in this. And that is what I saw happen in Israel from October 7th. Everyone has a job to do. Whether it's being a soldier, whether it is being a bus driver, whether it is being a teacher, whether it is being a guy who sweeps the garbage. Everyone has a role to play in making this country a better place. And it's about finding that role and doing it. And that is my message of hope for everyone at MIF and for everyone else. And that's also the message for the people who are anti-Israel. We're going to keep doing our job and we're going to keep doing it well. And you can fight us as much as you want. We're going to win.
Thank you so much, Shaun Sacks, for being with us today. And with that, I say goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.